While it's generally been a very difficult year at war for Ukraine, the last couple of weeks haven't exactly been fantastic for the Russians. Some of that was financial, with the Europeans approving new funding arrangements that should keep the Ukrainian budget running until at least 2027. Then there were highlights on land, with Zelensky taking a selfie at the entry to the city of Kupiansk, which the Russians claimed at the time, and still claim, to fully control. But some of the most interesting developments arguably took place at sea, with Ukraine significantly broadening its war against Russian energy exports and also giving the world a new military first, as the Ukrainian Unmanned Underwater Vehicle, essentially a drone submarine, apparently managed to sneak itself into a heavily defended Russian military port at Novorossiysk and introduce itself, very explosively, to a regular manned submarine. And so today we're once again going to turn our eyes to the war in Ukraine at sea, including this new way in which UUV technology has been deployed, and the implications not just for this war, but also for potential future ones. We'll start with what Ukraine has been trying to do in the Black Sea more generally, the role of Russia's submarine force in the Black Sea and why that might have become a target, and then move on to the attack itself. What was the target? How did this incident of submarine-on-submarine violence play out? What's our best assessment of how much damage was done? And then we can move on to the implications. Not just in terms of what this means for the future of the war in Ukraine and the potential further use of UUVs there, but also what navies around the world might be taking from the fact that, once again, another naval warfare first has been carried out by a country without much of a navy, especially as they look to their own UUV development programs and the potential of yet another new technology that's unlikely to get put back in the bottle anytime soon. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. While it might be fantastic if 2026 saw major international events hitting us with a little less frequency than 2025, somehow I'm not confident. And in that kind of frenetic news environment, even just passing the headlines can be difficult enough, especially when you account for what different news organisations might or might not choose to put front and centre. Looking at reports covering negotiations over the war in Ukraine, for example, this headline suggests that Ukraine might be willing to drop its long-held ambition to join NATO. While these ones elevate different context, like the fact that concession would reportedly be contingent on Ukraine receiving alternative security guarantees from Europe and Washington instead. The tool being used to sweep between headlines here is ground news. By drawing on news sources around the world, it doesn't just allow you to quickly compare headlines or prepare curated feeds, it can also provide valuable context, things like ownership information for the sources you're seeing. And ground news is really a tool that you can use in a way that fits what you're trying to do. Maybe you want to hone in on specific topics, or you might want to deploy a tool like the blind spot feed, which might surface stories that are mostly being covered in the kind of news media you might not ordinarily consume. That might not mean they're fantastic sources, but I think it can be handy to understand what different parts of the internet might be seeing. There may not be a silver bullet for challenges like online echo chambers, but the right tool might help, and there's a reason Ground News has been this channel's longest running sponsor. And so if you're interested, the link in the description will give you access to a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which is the one I use, giving you access to the full range of Ground News features. And with that said, let's get back to it. Okay, so before we start talking about the wider implications of the technology or what it might mean for the world, in this case, I think we need to start with what we just saw happen. Why was this attack launched, what was used, and what appears to have been the result? Without much in the way of a fleet of its own, most of Ukraine's strategy for dealing with the Russian Black Sea Fleet since 2022 has famously been highly asymmetrical, with key features being the use of things like naval drones and anti-ship missiles to steadily push the Russian surface fleet further and further back. Sometimes that meant actually sinking vessels like the Moskva, or in other cases just making areas of the Black Sea so dangerous to operate in that Russia wouldn't push its warships forward. Russia could, hypothetically for example, move assets towards the Ukrainian coast and try and blockade the constant flow of merchant ships carrying Ukrainian exports out of the country or valuably needed imports in. But with things like Neptune batteries and kamikaze USVs in play, that would probably risk adding a number of extra artificial reefs off the Ukrainian coast relatively quickly. You might have sometimes heard this approach of trying to zone out your opponent's assets as anti-access area denial, A2AD. But that Ukrainian A2AD combination of flying ISR assets, kamikaze naval drones and anti-ship missiles can't logically pose the same threat to every type of Russian naval target. They don't work particularly well if the target is submerged. While Russia has a massive submarine force, a lot of that inventory is made up of nuclear-powered Leviathans that tend to stick to the open ocean. The Black Sea Fleet instead relies on smaller diesel-electrics, with the key type being what NATO would call the improved Kilo 2, and the Russians the Project 636.3 Vazhavyanka. By international standards, these submarines aren't enormous, roughly 74 metres or 240 feet long, with a displacement of about 2,400 tonnes on the surface or just under 4,000 tonnes submerged. So maybe not something with the kind of endurance or performance you might associate with a nuclear attack boat, but very quiet, very dangerous, significantly more affordable, and good enough for an environment like the Black Sea or Mediterranean. Near the start of the war, you might not have thought submarines like this would represent a priority target for the Ukrainians. Submarines are often going to be at their most dangerous hunting ships or other submarines. Ukraine started the war with precious few of the former and none of the latter. But there are at least two factors, besides them just being expensive, valuable assets that the Russians clearly valued, and as a result the Ukrainians might have an incentive to break, that potentially made them more worthwhile targets. The first is that some of Russia's improved kilos can launch land attack cruise missiles. Perhaps not many compared to a surface warship or a flight of strategic bombers, but because the launch platform is a stealthy submarine, that missile attack might come with limited warning and from an unexpected angle. For an air defence system, neither of those are going to be welcome features to any attack. The other factor, perhaps even more relevant, is that a number of Russian figures, including openly on Russian state media, were talking about the possibility of using the submarines to interdict shipping to and from Ukraine. One plan we saw discussed, for example, was using Russian submarines to lay sea mines along the routes used by merchant ships travelling to and from Ukrainian ports. That could potentially destroy or damage ships, which might cause companies to stop shipping entirely or at the very least drive up insurance premiums, while the Russians could potentially try and deny responsibility entirely, saying the Ukrainians clearly put the mine there in order to hold the Russian fleet back. Without any effective way to track or hit the kilos while they were at sea or underwater, Ukraine managed to achieve their first major success against a Russian submarine by just hitting it when it was above water. These are images of the Russian submarine Rostov-on-Don after it was reportedly hit by a pair of Storm Shadow or Scalp cruise missiles in September 2023, resulting in a couple of minor alterations to the structure of the vessel. While this method clearly worked, however, there are some reasons it might not have been easily repeatable. Not only were Ukraine's supplies of Storm Shadows and Scalps deeply limited, you could also argue the Ukrainian campaign was made more difficult in a way by its own success. With Crimea being under the kind of pressing threat that it was, the Russians undertook a bit of a goodwill gesture and moved the bulk of the Black Sea Fleet's assets further east to Russia proper. So the target for this most recent Ukrainian strike wasn't Sevastopol in Crimea, it was the port of Novorossiysk. You can see I've got that circled on the image on the right there, with the Kerch Bridge in the centre for a little bit of orientation, and the Crimean Peninsula visible off to the left. So first thing that makes this a much more difficult target, it's a much longer way from any Ukrainian-held territory, and geographically much easier and much safer to wrap in air and naval defences. Since this was a sea attack, I also think it's worth reflecting on what the approach to the target must have looked like. This is the broad shape of the natural harbour at Novorossiysk, meaning any approaching ship or submarine would first have to manoeuvre through this constrained opening without being detected or stopped, and then get inside basically a fortress inside a fortress. This is a more zoomed-in view, and you can see the way the harbour at Novorossiysk is divided into different sections. Up on the top left, you'll see a number of civilian vessels loading or unloading. Given the way those barriers are laid out, if a subsurface threat did make it into this harbour, then reaching those civilian vessels probably wouldn't be that difficult. But most of the Russian military vessels we see at Novorossiysk are instead kept here. Think of it kind of as a walled compound for the Black Sea Fleet, with those boom defences functioning essentially as a gate. That is meant to be a well-protected area, sheltering the valuable ships and submarines inside. But if we look at the camera footage the Ukrainians released to the attack, that appears to be exactly where they hit. What I'm going to do here is quickly throw up the video the Ukrainians released to the attack, although keep in mind, parts of this video have been sped up or slowed down. Okay, so what we seem to have here is footage that was taken from the shore looking into this protected area. We pan over to the left. We see a number of Russian warships. The Ukrainians then helpfully identify what is pretty clearly a kilo, and then we get a small clue a Ukrainian submarine might be present as well. Pretty significant detonation that does appear to begin below the surface of the water. Note the camera was pointed before the explosion went off, suggesting the operator knew it was coming. We then get a slow-motion replay for good measure, coupled with the zoom out, and then a little bit of aftermath footage at the end, including helpfully some footage that extends to the point where most of that blast plume has helpfully dissipated. Even before we look at the satellite footage then, if we just look at stills from that video, it's pretty clear where we are. You can see the entrance to the protected area very visible in this image, although notably, with no visible barriers in place closing it off. More on that later. The pan out to the left then more than confirms it. The geography matches, the layout matches, and where else are you going to see that kind of concentration of Russian warships? Taking a satellite view then, we can identify pretty exactly where the submarine in question was, specifically this segment here, which we can see hosting a pair of submarines back in 2024, which matches pretty exactly this image we have taken after the attack, showing some of the effect. You have some clearly visible blast damage to the pier, which matches the kinetic renovations we observed earlier, and still in shot, you still clearly have the submarine in question. Some observers, by the way, believe we've been able to identify not just the type of submarine, but the specific example in question. We have footage from various sources of all of the improved Kilo-class submarines believed to be in the Black Sea Fleet. In a somewhat subtle expression of individuality, even within the same class, the submarines often have slightly different paint jobs. As you can see here, that leaves some observers to believe that the submarine in question wasn't just an improved Kilo, it was the B-271 Kolpino, laid down 2014 St. Petersburg and first commissioned in 2016. Now, what shape that submarine is in is something we can get to in a moment. But first, let's ask the question, what likely did this, and how did it potentially get there? The Ukrainians are claiming this was an attack by a UUV, an Unmanned Underwater Vehicle, basically a submarine drone. With the footage we have, I think we can rule out a lot of other potential explanations, like a missile attack or a surface drone. And while it is hypothetically possible this might have been some other type of underwater threat, say sabotage divers planting explosives, at this stage I think UUV is the most likely explanation. What exactly that UUV looked like, though, is pretty much anyone's guess. Many of the designs we've seen from the Ukrainians so far, though, and thus one of the more likely culprits, is essentially a cross between the traditional concept of a torpedo and an underwater drone. What you can see on the left there is an example from 2023, the Ukrainian Marichka, which as far as I can tell we only ever saw footage of in relatively basic testing, whereas more recently we've seen at least concepts shown off like this one. We first saw a small so-called Toloka underwater drone demonstrated in April 2023, but the manufacturer has also long hinted a desire to go much larger. If the TLK 150 was about 2.5 metres long, the larger models might run anywhere from 4 to 12 metres, at which point you're starting to get closer to the kind of systems you'd expect might be physically capable of making the trip out to a location like this, while still carrying enough bang to give us that effect that we observed. All the Ukrainian SBU has actually said about the system used in this attack so far, though, is that it was a sub-Sea Baby type UUV, with the Sea Baby, of course, famously being a Ukrainian surface drone. As far as I'm aware, there's no proof in the public domain yet as to what exactly an Undersea Baby UUV might look like. But if we assume it was launched from Ukrainian territory, rather than from within Russia or a surface ship, we're probably looking at a UUV on the larger end of the displacement spectrum by Ukrainian standards, carrying a pretty significant warhead. It also would have had to be capable of some relatively good navigation, even while apparently submerged. Logically, it would have had to first successfully be able to navigate into Novorossiysk harbour itself without hitting other ships, all while not accidentally hitting the bottom or breaching the surface and being detected, being inhibited by an obstacle, or simply getting lost. Successfully making the turn into the enclosure would have required some pretty precise navigation. The how here is very much speculation. Did the UUV have reasonable onboard sensors so it could perceive its environment and navigate? Was it able to rely on very accurate satellite navigation, even in proximity to a Russian military installation? Or was there potentially a degree of direct human, maybe local control involved? But however it was done, it does give us a pretty strong clue what kind of underwater navigation Ukrainian systems might be capable of. Then there's the question of how much damage was actually done. Despite us being able to physically see the explosion go off, this one's been a subject of pretty intense debate. Greatly complicating damage assessment efforts is where the explosion went off. In this case, we're talking about an underwater detonation that went off near but not directly against the submarine. As we can see in both the video and the satellite images taken before and after, the explosion pretty clearly went off to the aft of the submarine. A key target there would potentially be a submarine's propulsion system, which is absolutely critical to a submarine's operation, not particularly well protected, and, unhelpfully for us, submerged. The official Russian assertion is the Ukrainians essentially missed, and the submarine in question isn't damaged. There have been some very rough efforts, you can see one on screen here, to try and figure out roughly where the propulsor unit would have been relative to the explosion, what damage might have been done, and the images might, emphasis might, show evidence of the aft of the submarine sitting slightly lower in the water than normal, but I'd like to see more quality images and reporting before we make a conclusion on that one. Based just on what we've seen so far, if I had to make a guess, it's that a lot of complex engineering doesn't respond particularly well to an explosion of that size going off nearby, with us probably looking at least some damage done, although there's a question over how severe it is. We do know from satellite images that since the attack, a number of other ships and submarines in the enclosure have been moved, while the targeted submarine hasn't been, but as at time of recording, I wouldn't treat that as anywhere near definitive just yet. For me, though, where exactly the submarine sits on the spectrum from undamaged to unsalvageable is in some ways the less interesting question here, with the more significant ones instead being focused on how it happened and what that means. How did the Ukrainians know exactly when the barriers to the entrance would be gone? How did they time the attack to get the unit through that gap while it was open? Oh, and I'm sure someone in the Russian structure is probably going to have to answer a few questions as to how the Ukrainians apparently got access to CCTV footage of a Russian military installation and were seemingly able to use it to observe the execution and aftermath of an attack. This isn't someone hacking your smart fridge to figure out what you're eating for dinner. It's good quality footage giving real-time information on a sensitive military target. And so from a Russian perspective, in some ways this might be one of the most worrying aspects of the Ukrainian attack. Because unless you're highly confident that you know how this happened and that it won't happen elsewhere, you now have to be concerned that any camera, any sensor at any of your bases or any of your sensitive installations or any potential target might potentially be a Ukrainian intelligence asset. And on the flip side, I think it's a valid question to ask that if the Ukrainians did have access to this kind of footage, why make the decision to release it? Why demonstrate you had that kind of access instead of just relying on satellite images for verification, for example? I think that's a question we can quite easily raise on YouTube, but perhaps not an easy one to answer. I also think if we're analysing this operation or any operation, it's important to pay attention to not just what happened, but what could have happened. If you're a country in a conflict or another nation trying to understand a threat that an operation demonstrates, then you probably don't want to base all your plans, your investments, your assumptions around assuming that every future data point is going to play out exactly like the first one. Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, for example, that first time we saw small drones smuggled into a country and then deployed en masse to take out valuable soft strategic assets, in that case strategic bombers, is arguably a perfect example here. We're pretty confident that not everything during that operation went perfectly from either the Ukrainian or Russian perspective. It could have been a lot better, and it could have gone a lot worse. Some of the drones intended to be used in the attack appear to have never been launched or made it to their targets. One of the air bases appears to have made it off relatively scot-free, and so you can easily imagine a universe where those problems were more common and the drones did significantly less damage as a result. On the flip side, imagine the Ukrainians had rolled particularly well. There hadn't been any technical failures, the drones all made it to their target, and Russia lost basically their entire strategic air fleet in a single day. Based on what we think we know so far, both of those outcomes would have been plausible. But it would have been really dangerous for an observing country to look at an extreme outcome like that and assume that that outcome was inevitable. It would be dangerous to look at a scenario where the Ukrainians had completely king-hit the VTS strategic aviation assets and decide that, hey, this was an easy mode way to wipe out these kind of assets in the future. Or alternatively, if the Ukrainians had flubbed it, to ignore the kind of threat that small drones being smuggled into a country and then used to attack soft strategic targets might actually pose. Before Spiderweb, the Russians even arguably got a warning. Before that first mass deployment of drones against strategic bombers, we saw a small-scale one. In August 2023, small UAS were used in a behind-the-lines attack to destroy one Russian strategic bomber and damage one other at a base near St. Petersburg. In strategic terms, that was an extremely cost-effective pinprick, but it should potentially have served as a warning to the Russians of the Ukrainians in the future attempting something at a much larger scale. Novorossiysk should be a difficult target for a UUV attack. It's a prepared, permanent military base with no shortage of military assets and personnel present. The Russians knew the Ukrainians had been working on UUVs, and in other places, like the Kerch Bridge, they put in place defences to protect against them. If the Russian defences here had worked, or the Ukrainian system had suffered from technical difficulties and failed in its attack, then this operation easily could have ended up awash, barely even making the news. I mean, if nothing else in defensive terms, the Russians appear to have figuratively, and literally, kind of left the door open. The Black Sea Fleet ships are meant to have barrier defences protecting them. We can see them in some of the satellite footage. But very clearly, those weren't in place at the time the attack happened. Whether that was because the Ukrainians had special intelligence, or the Russians got lazy and left the door open a little bit too long, isn't something I think that's entirely clear yet in the open source. But my point is that even if the attack had failed because those defences had been in place or the Ukrainian system hadn't worked, it would still serve as a warning, I'd argue, about the risk of further attacks in the future. Just because I shoot at you and miss doesn't mean you should stand in the field like an idiot waiting for me to reload and try again. Because if you flip this around, while obviously the Ukrainians were celebrating the results of this strike, I'd argue that in some ways, unlike with Operation Spiderweb, the Russians might have got off easy here, because they've been hit hard enough to potentially force them to wake up to a potential threat, while not taking the kind of strategic scale damage that an operation like this could potentially have inflicted. And I think the potential for that kind of more damaging blow is there for at least two reasons. The first would simply be increasing the accuracy of the hit, whether that be through better luck or a technically superior system. But the lever you can more readily imagine the Ukrainians pulling here wouldn't be a qualitative improvement like that, it would be just scaling up the quantity. What if there'd been more than one? Or if there was more than one involved here, what if there'd been more than that? We've already seen this phenomenon play out with drones on land. FPVs, bomber drones, one-way attack drones. These are all things that had a notable impact on the Ukrainian battlefield early on, but they've come to increasingly dominate the way the war is fought and the associated casualty figures as the scale of those systems has ramped up. Operation Spiderweb included hundreds of small UAS. Some of Ukraine's naval drone attacks include multiple systems working together. So there's no reason to think that a future UUV operation might not include entire squadrons of systems rather than one or two. The area that sub was moored was nothing if not a target-rich environment. There were surface warships, mine countermeasure vessels, even other submarines. And so if you'd had other drones involved, whether going in with the initial system on some sort of follow-the-leader logic, or if they'd been independently controlled and sent in soon after as a kind of follow-on strike, the threat profile here has to consider a world in which we're not doing damage assessment on a single submarine the day after, but instead a significant chunk of the Black Sea fleet. That factor is also bloody important, not just in assessing the potential damage of these kind of strikes, but also assessing what kind of defences might work. Because with these kind of operations, you can sometimes end up with a bit of a rock beats paper dynamic, as long as you use enough rock. A common Russian defence against naval drones, surface or otherwise, for example, would be these kind of floating boom defences. They're obviously a much softer obstacle than the kind of hard defensive barriers you might be able to use in some instances, but they're easier to set up, cheap, flexible and quick to remove. They're also a long, long way from being a new idea. At their most basic, these kind of arrangements might be something as simple as basic flotation devices strung out over an area of water, supporting basically a large metal net, you can see an example on the right there, extending down to the bottom of the harbour. Any submarine, manned or otherwise, that tries to push through that kind of barrier is obviously meant to have a bad time. Here's a shot of Sydney Harbour during the Second World War, demonstrating what that kind of arrangement might look like at a larger scale. An opening where friendly ships can hopefully pass through or over the barrier, while most of the rest of the harbour is de facto locked off against enemy submarines. The problem with these kind of defences is that historically they are demonstrably not perfect, and you can breach them. In a modern scenario, you can imagine multiple drones being used to punch through this kind of defence scheme, with follow-on drones then moving through that gap. The point is that a defence scheme that might hold together against one or two threats might fall to pieces if confronted with a swarm of them. That wasn't the case here, and the defences we've usually seen Russia use in the area probably wouldn't have been vulnerable to that kind of breach. But I expect both the Russians and Ukrainians are looking at what happened and understanding that the can of worms that's been opened here is a lot bigger than just one type of attack against one specific target using one specific kind of drone, one time. Which leads to two natural questions, I think. How much did this attack specifically hurt in the context of the war as a whole? And secondly, what might it mean going forward? For Russia, the best case scenario is probably that they're not lying, the submarine is pretty much undamaged, and so the greatest casualties are perhaps a bit of national pride. Maybe one or two individuals find themselves rapidly reassigned from the top floor to the ground floor of a building, elevator optional, but realistically, that would make this scenario basically a near miss, with the imperative being to make sure it didn't happen again. In the worst case scenario, the submarine is fair-munted and can't go on operations again, at least not without significant repair. That would further sap Russia's already depleted submarine strength in the Black Sea. In February 2022, on paper, the Black Sea fleet had 6 improved kilos. With a lot of focus on the Mediterranean, though, 2 were deployed elsewhere at the time the Turks closed the straits, and as a result, at the moment, the Krasnodar and ironically the submarine Novorossiysk are actually based in the Baltic Sea rather than Novorossiysk itself. Rostov-on-Don was storm shadowed back in 2023, leaving 3 improved kilos and 1 older Project 877 based at Novorossiysk before this attack took place. You're talking about perhaps a third of the modern submarines that Russia had left in the Black Sea potentially being taken offline. That's obviously not fantastic news for the Russian Black Sea fleet, which hasn't exactly been having a fantastic war so far, but there's at least 2 reasons, I think, that kind of damage wouldn't really be decisive in the theatre. The first is that realistically, the submarines just weren't doing much on a scale that would move the needle on the wider war. They could launch a couple of missiles, gather intelligence, potentially threaten shipping by laying mines, but for the most part, the Russian Navy's contribution to the long-range campaign has been by launching missiles from its surface warships. Submarines aren't particularly useful if your goal is to protect your own shipping against Ukrainian attack, and the Russian Black Sea fleet isn't entirely cut off from reinforcements from elsewhere. Russia's unified deep-water system of canals and rivers allows them to move at least some of their smaller warships fairly freely between the Baltic, White, Caspian and Black Seas. Russia still has a lot of warships and naval assets in other theatres that it could potentially transfer if it thought it needed them. And so while some other powers, like the Turks for example, probably aren't complaining about an improved kilo potentially being taken off the board, Ukraine doesn't really have much hope of attriting the Black Sea fleet down entirely. Where these naval drone attacks, though, both surface and subsurface, might be of more concern from the Russian perspective, might actually be where the Ukrainians are deploying them not against warships, but against tankers. I think it's been pretty clear for a while now that the Ukrainians have been carrying out basically an energy campaign of their own. It's all about driving up pressure at multiple points to limit Russia's access to finance, increase the economic costs of the war, and potentially pressure them to shift their demands. What we've seen from the Ukrainians and their supporters, especially recently, is an attempt to come at this problem from different angles. One has been to just go after Russian oil production itself, with the news story here being that we've seen Ukraine launch a number of strikes against Russian oil rigs in the Caspian Sea. While by this point in the war we tend to consider Ukrainian long-range strikes into Russian territory a bit of an everyday occurrence, not generally worth noting, it shouldn't take away from the fact that, at minimum, a long-range drone attack from Ukrainian territory into the Caspian Sea is probably at least a 1,000-kilometre shot, almost all of it flying over Russian-controlled territory through Russian air defence zones, only to, at the end of it, try and hit a precision target at sea. These attacks individually might not do an enormous amount of damage, but they do add another set of targets that Russia is now pressured to defend, although that might be slightly complicated by the risk of Ukraine, attacking the defences. This image was recently released by the Ukrainians, ostensibly showing an attack on a Russian Rubin-class patrol vessel, again in the Caspian Sea. Those vessels are meant to be able to deal with a variety of lower-end surface and airborne threats, and I guess to be fair in this case, we can be pretty confident it destroyed at least one Ukrainian drone. So in summary, Ukraine has basically found yet another way to leverage its long-range drone assets, one of the few things it has in relative abundance, and use them to pressure Russian oil production, which goes along with step 2, trying to limit the amount of money Russia earns for the oil it does produce. Kinetic sanctions on Russian refineries force the Russians to import more finished products like gasoline from abroad, even going so far as to do things like scrapping import tariffs on imported gasoline, or allowing the use of fuels including previously banned chemical additives, in order to try and limit the amount of pain that Russians feel at the pump for refining capacity going down, and Russia having to compensate with imports that would otherwise be more expensive. Reduced refining capacity hasn't just meant that Russia has to import more of those valuable finished products, it's also placed pressure on their ability to refine those products for export, increasing the pressure to just export more of their output as cheaper, unrefined oil instead. Conventional sanctions make it more difficult for those refiners to get access to replacement parts, new finance, or buyers for all that crude oil that now has to go out. A tax on export infrastructure can then make that even more difficult, as do secondary sanctions on countries trying to buy the stuff at a price above the set cap. We now have data published by the KSE Institute which might help us understand the impacts of just one of those strikes on export infrastructure. After a Ukrainian strike on the Russian facilities at Tuapse on the Black Sea, exports fell from 192,000 barrels a day in October to about 50,000 in November. That caused Tuapse's share of overall Russian seaborne oil exports to fall to about 4%, helping to drive a significant increase in activity at other ports, including Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. Basically, you attack supply, demand, and the cost of goods sold all at the same time. And the place where the naval drones, both submerged and otherwise, might come into this is attacks on the shadow tanker fleet. Depending on the sanctioning country you're talking about, if you want to move cargoes of Russian oil without losing access to Western services like insurance and shipping firms, that oil needs to be sold at a price either under $60 or $47.6 per barrel. Russia's desire to sell oil above that cap led to the rise of the so-called shadow fleet. Basically, sanction-busting ships, in a lot of cases much older tankers pressed into service, with alternative insurance arrangements and a pretty brisk trade in trying to move Russian product. To give you a sense of scale and a valuable data point here, according to the CREA, in November 2025, shadow fleet tankers carried about 72% of all of Russia's seaborne crude oil exports. Those ships have generally been targeted by the US and other countries in a variety of ways. The vast majority of them are already under legal sanctions of some kind, but the Ukrainians have started to go after them more directly. The image you can see on the right there is a screen grab from a video of the Ukrainians hitting the tanker Dashan, which at the time was the third attack in less than 2 weeks. Note in each of those cases, Ukraine hit the tanker when it wasn't carrying a full load of oil, presumably to limit the risk of an ecological disaster, but getting hit by a naval drone packing hundreds of kilograms of high explosive is the kind of thing that tends to leave a mark, even if a ship isn't full of very flammable cargo. The Black Sea is an absolutely critical export route for Russian seaborne crude, and the goal here presumably isn't to attack or sink every vessel carrying it. For the sake of price stability, a number of sanctioning countries probably still want a lot of Russian oil making its way onto the market. They just don't want the Russians to make any money selling it. Instead, the goal is potentially to dial up pressure on Russia's pocketbook by going after everyone's favourite budget line, insurance costs. Remember, by definition, a shadow fleet tanker can't be insured by the Western companies that account for the overwhelming majority of global maritime insurance. So, if they're hit, The cost is borne by whatever Russian or friendly institution is deciding to take on that risk. They don't have an infinite pool of capital, and they're not charities. So they need to set their premiums to reflect whatever the risks to the ship in question are, whether that be mechanical failure, bad weather, or a Ukrainian drone hucking a couple hundred kilograms of HE a bit too close for comfort. As of early December, before most of these attacks had even happened, it was already reported that insurance costs in the Black Sea had jumped by something like 250%. Before the attack started, insuring a transport ship heading to a Russian port on the Black Sea might have cost somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3% of the vessel's total value. Since then, to quote from the article on the right there, the cost of covering visits to Russian ports in the Black Sea has jumped more than threefold, end quote. The worse the attacks get and the more persistent the threat is, the higher those costs are likely to go. And when it comes to exports, insurance costs matter because the whole reason you're doing it in the first place is to make money. And the more you have to pay to transport the stuff to the market buying it, the less it's going to be left over as profit in the end. Also putting pressure on transport costs is the fact there's always going to be firms, when there's a danger like this, that just aren't going to want to take the risk almost no matter what the price is. Even if the oil in question is being transported below the price cap, they still might not want to take the contracts because it increases the risk of their ships being hit or their crews being injured. Russia isn't the only job in town. They can try and put their ships on other routes, and that means the vessels that are still willing to take these contracts potentially have more bargaining power over the Russian sellers. We do have some pretty compelling recent data on how sensitive international shipping can be to perceptions of risk. The Houthis were subjected to large-scale airstrikes and a multinational naval operation to provide an escort to ships travelling through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. And yet despite that, they were still able to significantly suppress Red Sea traffic, because even if ships under escort would probably be okay, this is one of those cases where probably isn't always good enough. You're talking about shipping companies, not stormtroopers. And with the Houthi campaign, despite things like Operation Prosperity Guardian, a lot of them elected to take the longer route around Africa anyway. In June of this year, even after a ceasefire agreement had been struck between the United States and the Houthis, Red Sea traffic was reportedly still about 60% lower than normal. And while the Black Sea isn't a shooting gallery of a choke point the same way the Bab el-Mandeb is, the Ukrainians are not the Houthis, and the Russian Black Sea fleet sure ain't the US Navy. So I think it stands to reason that just as the Russians have the resources they need to drive up risks for ships travelling towards Ukrainian ports, the Ukrainians increasingly have the tools they need to do the same to the ships sustaining Russia's oil trade. We've already seen evidence of the Russians rerouting a lot of that Black Sea traffic to take a much longer route between Novorossiysk and the Turkish Straits. Broadly, instead of following a relatively fast, economically efficient and direct route, they've done something similar to what ships travelling towards Ukraine often do. They hug much closer to the coast, where they're as far as possible away from enemy assets and as close as possible to support. That might be able to bring down risks a bit, it has for the Ukrainians, but the question becomes, what kind of diversion do you need in order to be realistically safe enough? And how sustainable is that if the reach of your opponent continues to expand? In just the last day or so, for example, we've seen yet another first in the war at sea that might make you even more nervous if you're involved in the operation of the Shadow Fleet. On the 19th, the Ukrainians released footage of them attacking another Russian Shadow Fleet tanker, something we've seen before, but this time it wasn't in the Black Sea. It was in the Mediterranean. Basically, what it appears we're looking at here is an attack by small, short-range bomber drones on an empty tanker vessel that, according to Ukraine's SBU, was about 2,000 kilometres from Ukrainian territory at the time. According to ship tracking data, it appears the vessel was travelling west through the Mediterranean, at which point it was attacked, and then diverted to Egypt's Port Said. In this case, the technical nature of the attack, how it was done, is interesting, but so too are the implications. From a technical perspective, bomber drones just don't have the range necessary to launch these kind of attacks unless a ship is either very close to the shore, there was some sort of long-range mothership arrangement to extend the range of the drones, or they were launched from a ship. If you're a tanker, especially in a busy area of ocean, you're not going to be able to maneuver to give every other ship out there a wide berth. And while 99% of the time there probably won't be a container on board stuffed with a bunch of Ukrainian octocopters ready to come over and introduce themselves, insurance is a game all about percentages, and it often doesn't take much to do some very expensive damage to a soft civilian vessel. I think it's unambiguously clear that this is an escalation of the energy war by the Ukrainians. And now that they've proven they're willing to strike targets outside the Black Sea, every new capability they develop, field, or scale up that could potentially be used for those kind of attacks, including naval drones, might have a greater and greater incremental impact on the decision of ship owners or captains who are trying to figure out whether or not the Russian oil business is really for them. You're almost certainly never going to be able to stop all the ships out there deciding to transport Russian oil and the stuff ultimately making its way onto the market. But the less attractive the job proposition, the more it's likely to cost the Russians to do it. In a sense, the timing couldn't be worse from a Russian perspective, because you're looking at a squeeze on refining capacity, export capacity, and shipping costs all taking place at a point where the price the Russians are getting for some of those oil exports is basically at a record low for this war. Oil exports out of Russia's Asian ports are less affected, but according to that Bloomberg article on the right there, quote, on average, Russian oil exporters are receiving just over $40 a barrel for cargo shipped from the Baltic, Black Sea, and the eastern port of Kosmino, according to data from Argus Media. That's down 28% over the last 3 months, with recent restrictions targeting oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil widening the markdowns, end quote. For the record, Russia's 2025 draft budget assumes an Urals oil price of roughly $59 a barrel. In some ways, that $40 figure you see on the chart is economically even worse than that chart makes it look. Russia normally sells its oil in dollars, but it pays for the war effort in rubles. And for various reasons, including the massive interest rates Russia currently has in order to control inflation, and Russian companies having to bring foreign assets back into Russia, turning them into rubles in the process in order to avoid sanctions, the Russian ruble is actually much stronger right now than it was back when prices in US dollar terms were higher in 2022 or 2023. Near its peak in March 2022, a $90 barrel of Russian oil at an exchange rate of 130 rubles to the dollar translated to a total price of nearly 12,000 rubles a barrel. At current exchange rates, a $40 barrel at 80 rubles to the dollar gets you closer to 3,200. Plus, to add insult to injury, you have to remember that between 2022 and 2025, we've had 3 years of inflation. Getting $60 a barrel in 2025 isn't going to practically do as much to support your budget than it would have if you'd been getting $60 back in 2022. It's a basic economic reality that's currently squeezing Russia's oil firms, and indirectly, the Russian state budget. According to a source I'll link in the description, the Russian government's oil and gas revenues in December 2025 are expected to come in at a 4-year low, meaning you literally have to go back to some of the insane pricing we saw during the COVID era in order to find lower. And despite the Russian government playing around with the taxation system in order to try and draw more revenue out of the sector, the tax values they're getting a hold of per barrel look nothing like they did even in the first quarter of this year. None of that's to say the Russian government is going to run out of funds for the war tomorrow, but this is an economic pain point. That's not just supposition, it's something the Russians have been pretty openly saying themselves. Recently we saw Russia's Defense Minister Andrei Belousov speak at what was basically the Russian Defense Ministry's final board meeting for the year, if you will, and he described a situation where even the Russian Defense Ministry is now feeling the fiscal pinch. Quote, in 2025, the Defense Ministry operated under severe financial constraints related to the federal budget's capacity. However, military operations led to an increase in military spending. This required strict optimization and prioritization of the military budget and a restructuring of the internal mechanisms for its planning and execution. End quote. And all of this is coming, as you can see on the right there, from the famously pro-Ukrainian people over in Russian state media, who went a little bit further on what Belousov said the military had to do in order to handle the budget pinch. Austerity measures, he said, were applied. Some expenditures were deferred to later dates, others were reduced. And this made it possible to reduce the overall value of such expenditures as a share of GDP from 2.7% in 2024 to 2.2%. What he's essentially saying there is that due to the costs of fighting the Ukraine war, combined with the pressure on the Russian budget, the Russian military in 2025 basically had to cut back on anything that wasn't directly related to fighting the war in Ukraine by about 20% across the board. That might be some research and development, modernization, service life extension programs, you name it. The Russian budget can still find the money to fight a war, but it's increasingly struggling to find the money to do much else, including preparing for the next war. And where Ukrainian UUVs come in is the threat they could potentially, especially with more development, pose to Russian shipping. At a basic level, in order to bring insurance costs down in a free market system, you need to reduce the cost of an incident or the likelihood of an incident. In this case, the cost isn't really within your control. Ships are just bloody expensive, and the Ukrainians aren't going to put a smaller warhead on their drones because you asked them. So, from a Russian perspective, you need to find a way to stop those drones in an economical manner. One potential option is to arm those transport ships or provide the military escort. In the past, we have seen Russian ships fend off Ukrainian naval drone attacks, essentially using nothing but small arms. Think machine guns being fired from deck, either disabling the drones or causing the explosives to go off early. Similarly, it probably wouldn't take a top-tier naval warship in order to provide a lot of defense against surface drone attack. You might be able to use things like helicopters or drones to spot them, although there's obviously a risk there now the Ukrainians have started sticking bloody sidewinders on the things. But the basic point is, as long as the threat is on the surface, there's a lot of established counterplay options here. If the threat's submerged, though, that's a much more complex picture. There are technical and tactical problems to solve here if the Ukrainians want to take their UUVs and convert those into an effective tool to hold Russian tankers at risk. Conventionally powered UUVs don't exactly tend to be instant gratification weapon systems. They're often slow, require careful planning, and probably aren't the first tool you're going to think of if you're worried about dynamic or fleeting targets. If the Russians don't come up with effective answers to existing simpler solutions like USVs or UAS, then we might not see the Ukrainians pour a bunch of resources into UUVs and deploy them in that way. But because they now have those systems and those technologies in the developmental cooker, they've essentially got the blueprint for a new threat to deploy if Russian adaptation to other threats forces them to do so. Anti-submarine warfare or mine countermeasure operations aren't simple things at the best of times, and they're not jobs, realistically, that a giant civilian tanker is going to be able to carry out by itself. I don't think we've seen evidence yet that Ukraine's UUVs have got to a point yet where they can effectively be used against moving targets at sea. But based on what we just observed and what we know from other countries fielding these kind of systems, there's no reason to think they won't get there. And so if you're a Russian decision maker or someone in the business of ensuring ships travelling to Russian ports on the Black Sea, you might potentially be just as or more worried about this kind of threat than you are about the risk of a repeat attack against a military ship in the defended harbour. The core point is that in the context of the war in Ukraine, a single strike using a single UUV against a single Russian submarine really doesn't move the needle of the military or strategic balance. But if this attack serves as a kind of canary in the coal mine moment for the wide-scale and more effective use of UUVs in the conflict more generally, then it might potentially be at that level where they can have economic, not just military effects, where we see them start to become a bit more of a relevant factor. And if you're an observer elsewhere in the world, you probably have a lot of reason to be watching this very, very closely. Think of it this way. When we see reports on new hyped-up technological game changers in Ukraine, generally speaking, those things might fall into one of two categories. Sometimes it's a genuinely new technological development, in other cases, just a novel employment. Most militaries, even much better funded ones, don't currently have interceptor drones, for example, the way the Ukrainians do. A lot of forces don't have a distributed, decentralized acoustic detection system the way the Ukrainians do. And you could also point to other things from the way the Ukrainian battle management and communication system works, integrating a lot of civilian technology, through to some of the more obvious innovations we've seen from the Russian side, like the wide-scale employment of fibre optic FPVs. Those didn't, and still don't, have a direct equivalent in most NATO militaries. But in other cases, it's less a case of the Russians and Ukrainians coming up with something genuinely new, as taking something that already exists and being creative in the way they employ it. And with the use of UUVs, I'd argue we're pretty squarely in column 2. At their core, UUVs are not new technology. They've existed and been deployed widely for years for a variety of purposes. They're commonly used for mine countermeasure duties, for example, or as sensor platforms and decoys. Several states have also started fielding much larger and larger UUVs. Think things like the Ghost Shark, the Orca, or a number of Chinese systems that are capable of protracted periods at sea and carrying significant payloads. Likewise, the concept of using a submarine to attack a valuable asset while in harbour is also not new. In fact, historically, you could argue one of the most dangerous places for an enemy submarine to get to from your perspective would be inside a protected harbour or amidst a convoy. And no, historically defensive barriers didn't always work. In October 1939, German U-boat commander Gunther Prien, on his second wartime patrol, took his U-boat, U-47, and attacked the British base at Scapa Flow. It wasn't exactly a soft target, but Prien successfully manoeuvred the submarine through the various defences, taking a different route than the one he'd originally been ordered to, by the way, entered the main anchorage, and then let rip with a bunch of torpedoes against the warship's base there. Despite the German G-7E torpedoes displaying a degree of reliability that would have made even the US Navy Bureau of Ordnance at the time wince, the U-boat managed to torpedo the battleship Royal Oak, which sank with 835 of its crew. Essentially, like many of these attempted attacks against ships in harbour, it was a high-risk, high-reward operation. What's new here for the Ukrainians then is taking that mission concept, this technology, and sticking the two together. UUVs aren't new, these kind of attacks aren't new, but launching one of these kind of attacks with a UUV, that's new. And even if you limit yourself to focusing just on the kind of stuff Ukraine has talked about potentially fielding so far, which is mostly in that long-range unmanned drone torpedo type category essentially, just that kind of system might be enough to highlight a range of defensive problems. One, as the Russians have quite helpfully illustrated, is the harbour defence problem. Without proper detection mechanisms and defences, it might be possible for an opponent to launch a standoff UUV attack, potentially from their own waters, potentially from a warship or submarine stationed well beyond your shores, and then potentially go after some very valuable assets at a point where they're going to be static and potentially vulnerable. A formation of destroyers manoeuvring at sea with their air defence systems on and all their weapons armed and ready to go is going to be a pretty complex and challenging target, even for relatively advanced weapon systems. But, assuming you can reach it, even a top-tier warship at anchor, with its weapons safed, its sensors off, and half the crew getting deeply acquainted with the local liquor offerings, that's potentially a very valuable, but not particularly heavily armoured target. Of course, underwater threats to warships at anchor are nothing new, and there are already policy, procedures, tactics and techniques in place to deal with that. But these kind of longer-range UUVs probably won't make the problem any easier. And as the Ukrainians demonstrated, even what on paper should be relatively robust defences against this kind of thing might not necessarily work if you do things like leave the door open. The problem also doesn't necessarily go away when a fleet is on the move. What you're potentially introducing in this case is a new threat type that's arguably some combination of captive torpedo and a very particular type of submarine threat that thankfully probably needs to get close enough to hug you in order to do lethal damage. Are there warships out there with modern sensor suites that are generally capable of detecting things like torpedoes and, by extension, these large, longer-range kamikaze UUVs? Absolutely. But it's yet another potential threat that commanders might need to consider. But as we started to hint at in the Ukraine section, I imagine one area some decision-makers will be looking at is the threat these kind of systems might pose to softer targets. Either military vessels that don't have the kind of sensors and other features necessary to protect them against this kind of threat, or civilian vessels that obviously don't tend to roll out with a bunch of ASW sensors and anti-torpedo defences. Whether you're talking about the kind of advanced UUVs that might be deployed by a well-resourced nation-state to potentially lay mines, directly attack or harass shipping, or some of the more basic stuff, similar to what the Ukrainians are currently fielding, that conceivably could be obtained by a non-state actor or a less well-resourced state. Compared to basic surface drones, the technical challenges are a bit more significant here, but certainly a long way from insurmountable, and if you didn't need gold-plated performance specs, you might be able to make do with a relatively basic design and a lot of commercial technology. Civilian ships are particularly problematic as potential targets because they don't have their own defences, they're incredibly numerous, and a lot of the time they're going to be static in ports or harbours without anything in the way of underwater defence. And while you might be saying, sure, Perun, there are plenty of ways for a country or a non-state actor to potentially try and sink a civilian vessel. We have UAS, we have surface drones, we have missile systems. Is it really that significant if someone finds yet another way to punch a hole in the side of a lightly protected ship full of explodium? And in terms of the effect of the weapon system itself, I'd say potentially not. But you can imagine the problems potentially being caused not so much by the performance of the weapon itself, but how it could potentially be used. If someone launches an anti-ship ballistic missile against civilian traffic, for example, you're probably going to be able to tell where that came from. If someone is out there attacking ships using a manned submarine, they might try and deny responsibility, but if it happens to be identified and destroyed, whether because of the wreckage or the fact the crew has now disappeared and your submarine isn't appearing back in port, you're running a significant risk of someone figuring it out eventually. With systems like USVs though, or those short-range drones used by the Ukrainians in the Mediterranean, attribution can be more difficult. The thing might have been launched from a beach or pushed over the side of a civilian vessel 2,000 kilometres, 3,000 kilometres from the target zone. We know the Ukrainians were probably the ones who hit the tanker in the Mediterranean because they came out and told us. But if they'd flatly come out and denied responsibility, there might have been plenty of suspicions, but it would have been very difficult to prove. Almost every modern industrialised economy is intrinsically tied directly or indirectly to maritime logistics. And Ukraine is arguably demonstrating the potential of another affordable, accessible and deniable way that nations or non-state actors might choose to mess with those links. Moving back to Ukraine and Russia then, what should we expect next for the naval war and the deployment of things like UUVs? Looking at the campaign itself, the general theme for this war has been that without some sort of compelling pressure, the general trend has been towards escalation in targeting. Russia going after Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Ukraine going after refineries, then export terminals, then tankers in the Black Sea, then a tanker in the Mediterranean. The Ukrainians in particular are always going to be looking for ways to apply additional pressure and cost to Russia, and to signal that in this war, they still have cards to play. So unless we see something change, I'd expect we'll see a Russian retaliation adaptation to these recent Ukrainian strikes, while the Ukrainians continue to ramp up and adapt their own efforts. Regarding the technology itself though, especially when it comes to the more recent developments like the UUVs, I think we need to be prepared to see the same process played out that we've seen so many times before when a technology comes along and proves itself to be useful. They're going to steadily improve the capability, and they're going to massively ramp up the quantity. The first UUVs we saw from the Ukrainians were relatively basic things that wouldn't have had the range, the warhead, or probably the sensors' reliability and navigation ability to pull off the mission we just saw. They've come a long way, and we need to assume they'll get better. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, they already have a more experienced technological base to draw from here. Russia can manufacture drones, it can manufacture torpedoes, and it's already shown off and fielded UUV designs in the past. So if they decide they want to go further down this same developmental route, I think we have to expect that they'll be able to do so. Larger UUVs in particular are likely to be more expensive and complex to manufacture than some of the simplest things we've seen during this war, like small aerial drones, but that's not to say that they can't be mass manufactured. We saw this with USVs that were available in very small numbers early in the war, but which now have more complex production lines, multiple variants, different armament sets, and are routinely used in groups to carry out their missions. And so I think looking forward, we need to be prepared for that same story we've seen with UAS, UGVs, one-way attack drones, and a variety of other systems play out to at least an extent when looking at UUVs as well. In both the short term and beyond, that has implications for the likely costs of defending against them. As you can see on screen there, the Russians appear to have already responded to the threat against Novorossiysk by putting physical barriers in place. Sure, in this case, that might look a little bit like locking the gate after the horse is bolted, but remember, if you're a Russian decision maker, you have to assume the Ukrainians might try and do this again. Physical barriers are a low-tech, relatively reliable solution that's quick to implement. They're just inconvenient. But then again, if you're worried about this kind of attack repeating, you might just have to suck it up and pay that efficiency tax, rather than risk a repeat. Whether this was a UUV attack by a large, longer-range system or a smaller one launched from nearby, for countries with a longer time horizon to prepare, there are a number of existing or emerging technologies that might be useful to protect against the threat. One example here, in true Ukrainian fashion, would be to use drones to fight against the drones. Small, cheap and simple USVs equipped with sensors to detect them, or basic weapons systems to engage them, for example. But Russia isn't exactly in a position to just manifest a new fleet of technologically mature sub-hunting USVs in the Black Sea tomorrow. Meaning to some extent, they're either going to have to accept the risk, or the cost and operational inconvenience of setting up even heavier defences. One element to watch, I think, whether we're talking about UUV specifically or the naval war more generally, is where we see this trend of targeting civilian vessels go. Ukraine has the tools necessary to strike even harder and more often against the Russian oil trade. Russia, meanwhile, if it wants to cross that threshold, has plenty of kinetic options to go after ships travelling to or from Ukrainian ports. As to how the Russians and Ukrainians choose to use those options, though, only time will tell. And okay, let's go with a quick channel update to close out. I had originally been planning to cover something else this week and then coming back to the naval war in January, but after the series of tanker attacks and then the Novorossiysk incident, I thought it was worth a quick pivot. I still think UUV technology more broadly is probably worth a deep dive. A lot of countries out there are racing to develop and field some very, very capable systems with a variety of different missions in mind, but just to maintain some variety, I might hold that one over until early next year. Obviously though, we are coming up towards the end of the year, and so expect next week I will have a couple of reflections on how the year has gone, and also a little bit about what the plan for next year might bring. In the meantime, 2 updates related to the channel. I have started to go through and update the source lists for some previous episodes. In a number of cases, either due to a release time crunch or not being at the right computer at the time, some videos had to go live with less complete source lists than I would have liked, and so I'm slowly going through and trying to clean those up now. The other point is that Perun Gaming is once again active, with the start of a new series covering the release version of Terra Invicta having just gone live. So if you're interested, I even got some custom voice work done by one of the members of the original cast to add a little bit of extra character to the series. Feel free to jump over and check it out. Otherwise, I think that's everything for the moment. I hope you got something out of this week's episode, and hope to see you all again next week.